We'll begin with the salutation to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good evening, everybody. There's one short sutta that occurs in the Anguttara Nikaya, which has always made a very deep impression on me. The sutta states, "There is one person who arises in the world for the welfare of the multitude, for the happiness of the multitude, out of empathy for the world, for the good welfare and happiness of devas or deities and human beings." Who is that one person? The Tathagata, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one. So this very short sutta indicates that the very reason of being for the Buddha's arising in the world is empathy for the world, or compassion for the world. And the Buddha fulfills his compassionate intent by working selflessly, inexhaustibly, diligently to promote the welfare and happiness of living beings, especially human beings. The text uses the word bahujana, which means the many folk, the multitude. And so this spirit of great compassion, we could say, pervades all the teachings of the Buddha. And all of the teachings of the Buddha are in some way directed to fulfilling the good wishes, the wholesome wishes of sentient beings, and leading them to deeper levels of, first to perform wholesome deeds that will lift them up from the trap of bondage and suffering, and then to encourage them in practicing the Dhamma to ever wider and ever deeper layers until they fulfill their ultimate good. And so in the early Buddhist teachings, this great compassion of the Buddha becomes expressed, manifested in his ethical teachings, which encourage us to give up all types of actions which inflict harm and suffering on others, to engage in wholesome actions which will promote the well-being and happiness of others, and to purify our own minds through the development of meditation, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. In the course of the historical development of Buddhism, as we could say the seeds that the Buddha planted through his teaching flourished, took root and flourished, the teachings always conformed to the basic, we could say, the worldview, the mental framework, the needs, aspirations of the culture in which they took root. Not only the culture, but even the very historical period in which they took root. As Buddhism developed in India, as it evolved, there came what I would call a sustained attempt to inquire into what lay behind the work of the Buddha in realizing the Dhamma and proclaiming the Dhamma in the world. And this sort of sustained examination, sustained investigation into what I would call the long-range cosmic background to a Buddha's enlightenment, to a Buddha's presence in the world, eventually flourished in the form of Buddhism that we now call Mahayana Buddhism, particularly in the articulation of the Bodhisattva ideal. The Bodhisattva is the one who practices, cultivates the perfections, the spiritual perfections that will ultimately culminate in the enlightenment of a Buddha. Within the Mahayana tradition, there's one quite important work that belongs to the Yogacara school, which is called the Mahayanasutralankara, which means the ornament of the Mahayana Sutras. And within this work, there's one set of verses which I had encountered a long time ago, many, many years ago, and they impressed me very deeply. Originally, I found them in a book by Herbert Gunther on philosophy and psychology of the Abhidharma. And then later, many years later, I was able to find a full translation of the Mahayanasutralankara with the original Sanskrit. And then, more recently, I found the Chinese counterpart to those verses, and that is what is on the board here. And I thought that these verses are very relevant to the type of work that we are doing here, even though they come from a different tradition from that in which I've been ordained. But these verses seem to really express so succinctly, so clearly, the type of attitude that we apply to this work that we're undertaking in Buddhist global relief. And so I just would like to go through these verses and to explain the way I would understand them. Okay, the first verse in this particular series starts off by saying, having known that the world consists of mere formations, without a self, afflicted by suffering. Okay, this couplet is stating the classical Buddhist perspective on the nature of the world, the nature of human experience. Normally, we assume that we have a concrete self. The self is the center of our experience, and that conception of self, that deep, hidden conception of self, becomes the basis for grasping, clinging, selfishness, and then from there it leads to all of the conflicts, quarrels, disputes, exploitation, injustice that we find in the world. But when we practice the development of insight through developing the foundations of mindfulness, as the mindfulness becomes better established, as concentration becomes sharpened, then we see into the nature of our own experience, and we see that what we have been taking to be a self consists merely of what are called sankharas. These are conditioned phenomena that arise through the combination of causes and conditions. They come into being instantaneously, persist just for a moment, and then they perish and pass away. And so, what I take to be myself turns out to be a combination of these sankharas, conditioned formations. And yet, normally, we cling to these conditioned formations. We take them to be a self, but when we see that they are impermanent, then we also realize that everything within our being is without a self, selfless, empty, devoid of self.